You are listening to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Lucas, and at Method, our vision is to connect technology with humanity for a simpler digital future. Join us as we speak with leading experts to discuss industry trends, best practices, and emerging technology that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in. You are listening to the Build What's Next podcast, Digital Product Perspectives, and I'm excited for you to hear from our guests here today. Sitting down with Jason Rome, who leads our digital solutions here at Method, and David Brown, who leads the digital solutions operations for EDF Renewables North America. He is also part of the innovations unit for the Marine Corps. And you've done a lot of work with those guys. I'm sure we might unpack some of that as well. But two great minds in the world of digital products. And today, we are going to be discussing a framework that you've been working on here that you've kind of wrapped under the name of modern product, which I think we'll unpack. A lot of people may have some ideas of what that may or may not mean as we unfold, but we're going to unpack it all, and we're going to get into what are the pillars that you have that you kind of anchor to support this framework. And as people are listening to this on the front end, what should they look to get out of this conversation that we're about to have, and why is this going to be valuable for them and their enterprise?
Yeah, I think, when we designed this, it's really for leaders at companies and teams to connect the dots. And so, we're sitting here in the podcast studio, a lot of great books and a lot of great techniques. And I think what we see in organizations is really good intentions of using Agile, using human-centered design, using modernization of architecture, using DevOps practices. And you have all this passion inside these enterprise organizations. But, a lot of these practices were developed in Silicon Valley. They're developed by startups, or a lot of these kind of frameworks that are out there can feel really heavy. And so, building something that's a little bit more intentional to the constraints of working in an enterprise environment that's not a B2C company that takes into consideration the uniqueness of what companies are going through, and really just brings it all together in a very human way, in a very intentional way. This is one of the best jobs in the world. It's one of the coolest things that you can do. And, when you're in a place where it's not all connected and it's process heavy and it's bureaucratic and you get frustrated, it's not as enjoyable as it should be. And it's a blessing to be able to work in this space. And so this is really just about, the tools, the techniques, the practices that can help organizations connect the dots a little bit and really facilitate flow through the end-to-end system, but in a very impactful and a very efficient way.
Well, and one thing I want to call out, because David, you and I spoke about this just briefly before we, started the recording, was you guys you're coming to the table with two very different lenses that you're seeing this through, right? Jason, you're with Method, we are looking at it from the outside in. We want to come in and help guide our clients through these processes. David, you're in a different situation, right? Can you kind of share where you're coming from with this?
Yeah, historically, I usually work inside the company, so I get hired as an employee. Often, the title that is attached to me is in the realm of coaching. Come in and observe, run an assessment, and then make recommendations. And a lot of times it's really what they're asking for, even though they're not using the same language, is they're looking for an inside consultant to help them transform themselves or make the appropriate changes. So the timelines are very different with how we interact with the companies, and the fact that I have to be there through delivery and then I'm attached to the delivery as well. I think we look at time differently, and we look at how we run our assessments differently as well.
So we've got the outside in and the inside out perspectives coming together to talk through this framework. So let's dig in, Jason. So we're with the modern product framework that we're here to discuss, you talk about the different pillars that kind of support this line of thinking. Walk us through what those are, and how you can unpack those for our listeners.
Yeah, so the four major really systems that we think about are strategy, discovery, delivery, and culture. And culture we're using in the broadest sense of the term, because there's a lot of things that impact culture. It's the ways of working, it's the processes, it's the company's values, but it's also how the company is organized, how people are aligned to work. And so we'll actually save that one for last today. And so strategy, starting out, it's really the communication of the vision and the goals and how we're going to measure that and how we're prioritizing. I think one of the other things in the enterprise too is the resource allocation, the budgeting when it comes to strategy and making sure that the teams are going to have the resources needed. Discovery, it's really the art of both falling in love with the problem and finding the right solution, but integrating that meaningfully into the delivery lifecycle is one of the things that David and I will dive into. Delivery, this is your SDLC or your product delivery lifecycle. It's that end-to-end flow of prioritization and analysis through release. And then one thing David and I are both passionate about, it's not just about releasing, it's about measuring and reflecting on what worked. So we'll touch on each of these 4 systems and we look at, how can they be systematic and connect the dots? How can we make sure they're human? How can we be intentional of the practices we adopt? How can they be productive? And how can we make sure that leadership's vision cascades down to the teams executing? And so so we'll start there and dive into strategy. I want to let David comment on this one first because he uses this term strategic intent, which I think is really interesting. And strategy can feel like a really big, heavy thing. And so, David, I'd be curious your thoughts. Like when you think of strategy in the guise of product digital transformation, like how do you frame that thought? And especially coming into an organization that might have a detailed strategy, might not have a detailed strategy, what are you looking for and what is that, output format?
Yeah, I want to say within my experience, a lot of times it's not a detailed strategy. I hardly ever see a very detailed strategy. And if it is something that is detailed, it's really just a list or, hopeful intentions. I tend to think of strategy as a decision-making framework that can scale across the organization to where everybody in the organization that is pushing towards or supporting the strategy make the right decisions at the right level. And so I think having an organization having the understanding of they need to constantly calibrate of are decisions being made at the right level and when does that need to change. But when we talk about intentions, that's right in line with the fact that we can't predict the future. So our strategy should be aligned to predict as much as we think we can, and then we reevaluate when we start to see that we need to calibrate because our predictions are a little bit further along than what we can believe.
Yeah. I like that as a decision-making framework and decisions being made at the right level, because I think one of the anti-patterns of strategy that I see is leadership as a bottleneck. And I think if you look at how strategy used to happen in kind of a pre-agile, speedier world, you'd have someone come in, look big picture at the market, and you'd be able to set a strategy for a year or two, and then leadership's cascading that vision and going down and executing on it. And there's a lot less ambiguity. And just like the release cycle, the market cycle took a lot longer. And I think now you see, teams trying to make decisions and, unmade decisions are the killer of productivity in a modern product organization, because just the ripple effect of one unmade decision, it blocks the engineering team, it blocks the product team, it blocks the design team, and that ambiguity without the empowerment of that team is an absolute killer. It was a long time ago, but I talked to one executive that they made the comment, I didn't work to get to the top of my career not to make all the decisions. and I think sometimes like that mindset. And so it's all about, what's the correct altitude at who should be making those decisions and how should be made. And so, for me, there's a little bit of a difference too between a digital strategy versus a product strategy. And it depends on the type of organization. I think a lot of times with digital strategy, you can get it to a one-page vision if you're really articulating what is the role digital is going to play for your company. How does it impact your core val prop? Does it actually change your product? And so what I mean by that is, if you look at banking, for example, banks have undergone digital transformation. Fundamentally, you're still consuming the same product at the end of the day. Your checking account hasn't changed that much, but you interact with it differently. Versus if you look at Netflix fundamentally changed the consumption of media.
Right.
And so for a lot of companies, digital might not change the consumption, like what the actual product is, but it changes how customers interact with it. It changes how their employees support it, changes how their business operates, and it dictates change of their culture. And so with the digital strategy articulating, how does it change, my core value delivery? How does it change how customers interact with me? How does it change how my employees get their work done? And how does it change how I operate my company? Can really help distill the role digital is going to play in your overall strategy. Versus on product strategy, a lot more of that is about competitive advantage, differentiation, like what is the role product's going to play in the market. Now, there's a lot of overlap between these. You still want to think about competitive advantage with digital. But I think being able to put that on one page and align that, and a lot of times I find 80% of that is in the organization. It's in people's heads. There might be like articulating it slightly differently, but getting it on paper, getting aligned, and then articulating it over and over again is really important. I did an assessment with a company recently, and every quarter their CEO sits in front of all their product and engineering teams and re-articulates what the business vision is, how it ties to the digital strategy. And one of the first questions we ask in our modern product assessment is, it's a Likert style survey. So we ask people to strongly disagree to agree, and said, I understand how my work contributes to the company's vision. It's the first question in the survey. And that company got 100%. First time I've ever seen that. And I said, why do you guys do this? And he said, every quarter our CEO sits down and does a town hall with everybody and re-articulates the vision in a very clear, distilled way. When I went through their vision, I was like, I'm ready. Like, put me in, coach. I feel like I can do some product here and get going for it. So I don't know, David, I'd be curious, like when you get in and you grasp the strategy, like what's the first thing you're trying to do? Like, how do you incrementally from an inside out perspective, like move that forward a little bit?
Yeah, it's different. Through my experiences, like I said, often it's not very clear. So that's the work that I'm either brought in to help do, is help bring clarity to like, what are we doing and how does it amount to the organization strategy? Sometimes that's a down and up or a push to say, all right, if we define what this is, does it support that? And I think where that's been successful, thinking about the last couple of companies, is that probably helped define the organization strategy and what they wanted to do is to say, hey, we see this shift in the market's coming. This is what we want to do about it. And we want you to see that shift with us. So it's been very different in the fact that often we have to define ourselves first, and then we push that to the rest of the organization to help them see what good definition looks like.
Yeah.
I do think it's a good call out. I mean, I hope a lot of people are doing this, and it's great that, this is one of the practices that you're trying to put into place, but that re-articulation over and over and over, especially, I mean, I'm sure you guys have experienced this even more than I have, not being on the client side quite as much, but when you get heads down into this work for months and months and months, you don't realize how easy it is to incrementally start stepping away from the vision, from the strategy that was initially put into place just because of conversations you've been having, work you've been doing, and then you kind of have to get that like, oh, hey, by the way, remember, this is where we're going. This is what we're marching towards. And you're like, oh, yeah, sometimes I have to reorient the path that I'm on.
Yeah, I think, two key things, like actionable takeaways for people with this. Like, one, I think in this post-COVID world where it's a lot of remote work, it's a lot of meetings, like our day is broken up into half-hour and hour-long chunks.
Yeah.
That's not enough time for strategy. And so I think a lot of times just having more time for your team to talk about strategy, but really sitting down and grasping the consequences and talking through it and getting people of different beliefs in one room and just wrestling it for a while. I think that's one of the cool things in our work sometimes is we get people together that don't spend a lot of time talking, and our project might be a forcing function of, hey, we did this research, this is what we're finding, this is what your clients are saying, and having the head of technology, the head of product, the head of marketing all in one room, kind of grappling with the consequences of that and like how it impacts their beliefs is really powerful. And so I think just making a little, asking yourself, how much time do we really spend taking a step back and discussing strategy? And it doesn't need to be every day, but what are those little beliefs that are different for folks in the organization, and be able to think about that to help move things forward?
Yeah.
It's just like a very actionable thing, and trying to articulate it. And then another thing that's easy, especially if you're on the team, like executing day to day and wondering about how your work ties to strategy, there's two directions you can go for this. So you can take a company goal related to product or digital, and if you have that goal and you ask yourself how, within 2 or 3 hows, you should be able to get to something you're doing. So, hey, this company goal is this. How are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? It should get to an epic or a feature to be able to articulate. On the other side, if you have a set of work you're doing, you should be able to ask yourself why 2 or 3 times and get to a company goal. And if you can't climb back up that chain, that's a strategic gap on the, hey, we're executing on something that's potentially not aligned, versus if you can't ask why 2 or 3 times, the strategy is probably too high level and too ambiguous. And I think you get back to your point around like making those decisions. Like the executives shouldn't be in the epic and feature level. They shouldn't be making decisions at that level. There should be enough of a strategic intent to be able to do that and execute on. I don't know if you have any other kind of closing thoughts on that strategy side and like the decision making. And I know we're going to talk about empowerment later, so I'm trying not to take the bait, but yeah.
No, I think that's good. I like your reference there of being able to use hows and whys to align everything. I think the measurement aspect of it is when decisions are made, capture those. And I don't think we do that enough. I think most companies are really good at starting things, but then not either finishing or wrapping it up and saying, all right, what decisions were made when we were leading this large initiative or this large project? Were they made at the right level? If we were to do it all over again, where would we have pushed these decisions more appropriately? And so I think it's right in line with that.
Yeah. And I think something you hit on there too is like capturing those decisions, but also capturing uncertainty.
Yeah.
There's so much uncertainty in this space of what we do. And some of that can be solved in discovery before production, but a lot of uncertainty in this space, it's going to happen in prod. Like it's going to happen after you're in prod. And so if you're not revisiting your strategy once things are in production and like testing your beliefs and updating them,
yeah,
it kind of destroys one of the most important feedback loops. And so it's okay to say like, we don't know, or like we're 80% certain of this. But if we don't capture that uncertainty, if we don't pass that on to our teams, I see this a lot at organizations. It's kind of this ostrich effect of like, well, this is the strategy. So yes, I'm going to build features to that. And we're not getting people to ask the right questions, which means we're not learning enough as we're doing that, which is probably a good switch into discovery as a conversation. And so, in our view, after strategy, not everything out of a strategy is going to go to discovery. And I think that's one thing you and I both align on, David, is that there's some things you just got to do. You're modernizing, you're doing core integrations, like, some things are just simple. They have a very clear cause and effect relationship. But a lot of the work we do is complicated or complex cause and effects. And so, David, we talk a little bit about, what is just enough discovery? Like, what are the anti-patterns of discovery? I know this is something, especially for you, building out discovery in, not consumer organizations that have kind of a traditional discovery, working in like the utilities type space, working in the military. I'd be curious your thoughts on like, what are the anti-patterns you see in discovery? What are some of the trends you're seeing there? What companies can do better?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to call out is the word can be used a couple different ways. So there's upfront discovery, something we haven't done before. We need to do some sort of risk assessment or profile. And then there's continuous discovery for the things that we've already deployed, but we want them to get better and influence change that way. And I think being able to articulate that with especially the finance side of the house, when they're talking about, hey, how do we bill for this or bill back for it correctly, letting them know that there are different types and we'll use those differently, and we need to build those into our artifacts so that they are better or more equipped at their job. Another aspect of it is discovery is essentially it's a risk mitigation set of activities. It's not a lean event. And so when companies try to say, all right, we're only going to dedicate this much time to discovery, but they don't know how to do it or they've never done it before, they're trying to use a muscle that they've never built.
Yeah.
And so for companies that have internally invested in building this as a muscle, as a pattern, yes, they can start to change and lean it out and get more precise with how they run these activities. But I think that's the biggest thing is, we read a book about discovery. Now we can make it a 1-week sprint. And there's a lot of intentionality associated to, no, we need to carve out dedicated time. And if you've never done it before, it needs to be an immersive experience. Everybody needs to come to the table and play a role in discovering and de-risking the thing. And then also seeing it all the way to the end to say, how did that discovery enable different decisions along through delivery?
And how often do you see that? How often do you see companies who, to your point, know very little about it, but assume, well, I know a little bit, so I can do it, and just run with a project that has long-reaching implications for like where the company's going, and it's a lot of it is based off of a weak discovery muscle. Do you see that happening a lot?
Yeah, I do. And I think one thing to call out, because we say this a lot, you guys both use the word muscle. But I do use, say that, hey, discovery is the muscle, not the exercise. And so, it's like if you're trying to get stronger, you don't go to the gym and bench press once and say, I am stronger.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of people see discovery as the bench press and not as the muscle that's getting stronger from it, is one of the key things. And so it is treated as either events that are discrete and too large versus something that's embedded into the process. And I think discovery is one of those things that's really important, but very rarely urgent for companies. And so when product teams, when designers get busy, when the backlog's not full, discovery is very easy to cut from the budget or cut out of processes, because it's never going to be a burning platform for that to be able to do it. But outside of the first sprint demo of seeing live code, feedback from users is the most rewarding event possible in this work. It's the teams that work with me know that even before the client sees it, I'm always asking for the preview of it. It is really important. The other thing that David said that's really important is it's a risk mitigation and a decision-making framework. And I think the other anti-pattern that I see sometimes is, discovery will happen, insights will be created from research, and then we're trying to figure out the question we wanted to ask the research. And so now open-ended discovery is great, more of what's kind of called generative research versus evaluative research, where we just don't know what we don't know. And so I know we had Bob here yesterday doing a podcast on jobs to be done and being able to use jobs to be done to do that. But, that type of research is valuable, surveys, collecting feedback, voice of customer, that type of thing. But going into research with a clear set of hypotheses and decisions you're trying to make and what you're looking for to help you make that decision. Mm-hmm. And so, in user research, you go test something and come back and say, 6 out of 10 people liked this. Is that good? What about the other 40%? Is that bad? Does that change your mind? And so making sure you have the framework of, hey, what are we going out to find? And at what point is it going to change our mind and help us make this decision? Yeah. Because I think, discovery should lead to action, not more discovery. Yeah. Is one of the things that happens is oh, well, now we need to go kind of do all these things because we missed this. And so when I'm talking to teams, I'm talking to clients, I always say the sooner that our insights can start to intersect with your beliefs, that's when true discovery happens. Because, there's this kind of sense discovery isn't just, that's not all the information we've collected. We're always going into with a set of beliefs about our product, about our users. It's kind of it's a set of Bayesian priors, if you look at Bayesian statistics and that type of thinking. And
I do that all the time.
Exactly. And if you don't, I told you it'd get nerdy. And if you don't have that kind of foundational knowledge of what are our beliefs and what are we open to being shaken on, it's hard to compare that to the research because there's bias in all the research that we do. There's always going to be misdating points. It's not ever going to be perfect because to get that level of perfection, it's going to be really expensive. Yeah. And so you have to have that framework set up front as how is this going to help us make a decision and create change? Yeah. So David, one thing you said to me a couple of weeks ago that I've shamelessly ripped off is that discovery is not free. And kind of your point that companies think if they don't hire someone from the outside to help them with discovery, they're going to be able to do it for free themselves. But in reality, there's a cost. We just don't account for it well. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on, I really love how you've very intentionally injected discovery into your SDLC as a milestone, as a point for leadership to share a perspective, and it kind of connects that dot between strategy and delivery. So talk a little about that, because I think it's really cool what you guys have done.
Yeah, so it's not free for a couple of reasons. Either if you've never done it before or done it well before, you need to bring someone that it can, and that's either through working with a partner or consultancy, or you need to create the headcount space to bring people with that skill and expertise in. Either way, it's an investment. The other side of it is if you don't make it part of your delivery model or your large SDLC associated to how you deliver, you will probably just keep that proximity bias of we know what our problems are and we'll solve for them. And so where this organization has done a really good job, especially with the leadership team they have in place, is saying, what are we trying to de-risk? How do we know that we're focused on the problem and not on the solution that really kicked off the intake? Because most things that come through intake are solutions. Hey, I heard about this thing at this conference, or someone in a similar company told me about how they're doing this thing and we want to buy it. Cool. Let's do the right opportunity or problem assessment associated to it. And there needs to be real rigor around that. So we're just not saying yes to anything. And then at what point in time do we need to have another touch point to say, did we appropriately level set on what is the thing that we're trying to mitigate? What are the types of risks? And that's different for every company. And I think where I get a lot of benefit of, I have my day job and then I have my professional hobby, and that they're so well aligned, is they have really different risk profiles that we have to vet. And so it doesn't get me stuck into like one methodology or framework to say, oh, that's the one that solves the problems. It requires customization. And that customization is what you're buying and the saying that we attach to discovery isn't free, which not everybody loves that saying, is that when you build this as a muscle inside your organization, you're changing discovery from a cost that you're acquiring to now we're intentionally spending into it. So we're saying, hey, we want to invest this much into the appropriate amount of discovery. You have to learn that for yourselves so that, and then this is where the measurement keeps going, is because we did discovery, what different decisions did we make that we probably wouldn't have made if we didn't do it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I'm having a conversation with a client right now about the business case for discovery. And this is the amount of spend we have planned. This is the revenue that's intended to result from that spend. This is our uncertainty that's left over. And like, those are like, this is what we're spending. This is how uncertain we are. This is the revenue and the cost that we're potentially putting at risk. How much should we invest in discovery to both de-risk the investment side as well as the result side where we have uncertainty? And I think that was like a powerful aha conversation that we had with them of like, oh, this is how we can justify a CX team or like a little bit of a research team to integrate, because we don't currently have that. One other thing I want to bring up, and it's kind of between strategy and discovery, and I know you and I both like initiative boards and enterprise Kanban as tooling. Shifting left the voice of technology before discovery, I think, is really important. So we call it the low fidelity alignment conversation, but people see discovery a lot of times just as the domain of business product design teams participating in that. And one of the negative things that's happened over the last 20 years is, engineers unfairly got asked for estimates without good requirements and then got held to those dates over and over again and kind of got blamed for poor requirements, poor discovery, being asked for estimates too early. And so there's often a hesitancy without good requirements for engineering to weigh in early on initiatives. And organizations are really missing an opportunity there. There's so many technology accelerators out there. There's so many different ways of working that, before you go into discovery, bringing the voice of architecture and engineering in and asking them, like, not how big is this thing that we're attempting to do, but saying, hey, if you were to think about us trying to take on this initiative, where are the big rocks? Like, what are the things you're going to be worried about? What are the things that you're going to be concerned about? And so we're not asking them to give us an estimate. We're saying, what are the things that would impact the estimate? And then when we go into discovery, we can steer into that or steer away from it so we know where their big rocks are. So I was working with a client on this, and it was going to be a modernization of kind of a complex data problem across multiple teams in the organization. And we were also replacing this external vendor as part of it. And so originally there was a plan to do a long 8-week discovery, but instead, I was able to get on the phone with the head of architecture and kind of go through my thoughts of like, hey, this is what the solution would look like. Tell me where we're going to get hurt on this engagement if we try to replace this vendor solution. And he was like, actually, most of the APIs we've built with this vendor, so a lot of that we already have. We have the connective tissue, like the front end shouldn't be a challenge. He's like, let me tell you about the rules engine. He's like, the rules engine, it's been built up over time. There's a lot of kind of nested logic and if-then statements. He's like, so untangling that is going to be probably the hardest part of this and making that maintainable. And so we took an 8-week process down to like a 2-hour conversation. And then when we started doing our requirements, we knew it was less of a technical problem around integration and was going to be more about distilling the rules back to a rules engine. But we were able to like really focus where the feasibility challenge was going to be.
Yeah.
And he got to share his opinion before we started any discovery of requirements. And it really directed that. And so I think bringing in that voice of engineering and architecture sooner into the discovery when you're looking at initiatives and having that early alignment, because they're going to be able to see things that nobody else can because they understand what's going on with the modernization, the architecture, and like, oh, actually stay away from that because you're going to run straight into our data lake modernization. Like, hey, this is the alignment of that. So that's the other thing.
How often are you running into this siloing effect where people are just trying to start moving forward, trying to start making momentum without first considering the fact that, like, hey, we're operating in a silo. We're not cross-functional. We're not getting insight from the people who are going to be significantly impacting this downstream. Is that a pretty common occurrence, or have we been able to, as an environment or as an industry, have people started to acknowledge that, hey, this is a problem, we need to move away from it?
I think people are starting to acknowledge it for sure, and getting better about it. There's other silos that exist. Like sometimes, the product team will ask us to redesign an experience that's like web oriented, and the marketing team's not at the table. So we're not allowed to, but if you go do research on any kind of website, any kind of product onboarding, like new product purchase experience, you're going to run into feedback on the core value prop and the content strategy and how it's being marketed. Mm-hmm. And so like being able to redesign a website without being able to have a conversation with the marketing team around like what you're learning there is really hard. There's definitely going to be times you're going to be hired by the business to do something, and the technology team is going to be seen as a recipient of that versus an active participant in it. And so it's gotten better. I think the pendulum swings all the time with these things. I don't know, David, I'd be curious your thoughts.
Yeah. You asked how often. I think every time that I've seen. But
even those who swear they're not siloed just don't know the silos they're operating in.
So the trade-off there is when you try to break down all silos, then maybe nothing gets done.
Yeah.
And so you pay for coordination costs. And so the organization has to identify, like, what is the appropriate amount of siloing and when do we break those? And those are either points in times or event-based, or both, or maybe neither. But ultimately, that's what's built into the strategy conversation is when do we come together? When do we make decisions? And how do we identify we have the right people at the table? I love your point about, hey, we need to bring architecture in sooner. And that's something that's changed a lot, probably within the last 5 years, because most architects, and there are several different architects, and they need to, if there's a architectural community inside of organization, they need to have clear lines of like, what is my skill set as this type of architect? But most of them are incentivized to go straight to solutioning. And so there's training or awareness that has to occur to say, hey, if we're bringing you into discovery, it isn't to rush us to solutioning. It's to say when we go down solutioning paths, bring reality to us so that we know what we're going up against.
Yeah.
And so with the architects that I've worked with and that I do work with, some are really good at that, and some of them don't enjoy being in that room because that's not really what they want to do. And so I think there's a lot there to unpack, but I think every single time.
So, I think before we transition into delivery and silos and partnership between product and engineering, I think quick hits for discovery and what teams can do. I think the first, and this is where we like to use initiative boards, but having a staging area for the organization of this is the stuff that's not in JIRA yet that like we want to do in the future, and having that list prioritized, and for everything on the list having a view of, do we understand the business value? How does it contribute to a goal? Do we understand the discovery and the hypotheses we want to validate before we're going to build? And then from an engineering perspective, do we understand which teams in the organization, whether they're Scrum teams or platform teams or third-party vendors, who is going to have to be involved, who is going to be dependent on that? Having that list prioritized and, the business, product, engineering all signing off on it, because that way, before we start work and pull work forward, we know the amount of discovery we need to do. We know which teams are going to be impacted, so we make sure they all have a seat at the table and they all have capacity.
Yeah.
And that just creates kind of a backdrop for true visibility and transparency of what are we hoping to do? Why are we hoping to do it? What do we need to do to set that work up successfully so we can work backwards from, hey, if we want to do this in Q3, we've got 6 weeks of discovery work to do. So that how does that line up with the timing? And we're just, not getting to our next increment and getting rushed. And just starting to have those lightweight discovery conversations where we interrogate the work that we plan to do and kind of prioritize it and get everyone on the same page much sooner in a very cross-functional way. I don't know, anything else, David, you'd say like, hey, what's something that people could do immediately?
Yeah. So just, you have to build in the time. Just because you completed discovery doesn't mean you can go right into delivery. And I think I've seen and fell into that trap myself so many times. When you're looking at your full life cycle across how you deliver, the people you pull together to take it through discovery are probably not all the same people that are going to be part of delivery. And there needs to be a capacity and demand reconciliation that has to occur to say, all right, if we're going to move right into delivery, when do we need to do that? Zooming back out, how do we do our budgeting cycle that's tied to that? And how do we write off the costs that were accrued through discovery need to be weighed into timing as well? And so those are the tangibles that I don't necessarily think companies think about. And so they make it more expensive for them to do discovery, which makes it harder for them to build it into their process.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap. Now, if you're listening, there's still more that we haven't covered. We talked about in the intro that, we discussed strategy and discovery here, but we still have more topics to cover, which we are going to roll into a part 2. So stay tuned. We're going to get into delivery and culture, and Jason and David want to talk about the empowerment that goes along with some of those things as well. So stay tuned. We're not wrapped. There will be another episode to cover the rest of that content. We hope you enjoyed this. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on this episode. And we look forward to finishing the conversation for part 2 of this modern product discussion.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.